Looks like we're off to a good start. I guess I'm going to go ahead and get started. First and foremost, I want to say thank you. Welcome to the very first installment of Florida Oceanographic Society's 2021 Coastal Lecture Series. My name is Zack Jud. I'm the Director of Education at Florida Oceanographic Society, and I'm really excited to kick off our series tonight with a lecture about invasive reptiles and amphibians. I know many of you are lecture series regulars. I'm sure a lot of you are a little disappointed that we're not doing these lectures in person at the Blake Library in Stewart. You know, in light of COVID, we had a tough decision to make. Initially, we considered canceling the entire lecture series, and then we realized that Zoom webinars have been working pretty well for us. We wanted to try to do the entire 2021 lecture series using Zoom, and I'm really excited that we made that decision. You know, in the past, we enjoyed having a face-to-face conversation on Tuesday nights, but we were limiting our audience to people that lived here in Stewart. Now, by using Zoom to do a virtual lecture, we're able to reach people around the United States and around the globe. I'm excited to tell you that last year's Coastal Lecture Series broke all of our previous attendance records. In 8 lectures, we had over 1,700 attendees, meaning our average attendance was over 200 people per night. I'm really optimistic that we'll see similar numbers this year. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture, I hope you will share these with your friends and family, not just here in Florida, but around the country. We'll see if we can get some really big attendance in the future. Before we get started, I do want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Your microphones are going to be muted tonight. You'll be able to hear me and see me, but I'm not going to be able to see or hear any of you. It's a little bit weird talking to my computer rather than talking to an entire packed auditorium. But that's okay. You will be able to interact with me. If you have any questions tonight, you all should have a Q&A box on your Zoom tab. If you type your questions into the Q&A box, I will be able to look at them at the end of the lecture, and hopefully I'll try to answer your questions. The other thing you might want to do is go under View Options I believe it's in the upper right-hand corner, and select Side-by-Side View. That will allow you to adjust the size of my PowerPoint versus my face. Ideally, you want my face really small and you want my PowerPoint really big. All the interesting stuff tonight's going to be on the PowerPoint slides. You really don't need to see too much of me. So again, go under View Options, and then under select Side-by-Side View, and then there should be a slider where you can drag to increase the size of the PowerPoint and shrink the size of my head. Now, since we're all together tonight for the first time, I thought it would be great to go over our schedule for the 2021 Coastal Lecture Series. We are doing things a little bit differently this year. In the past, we were thankful that the Blake Library invited us to use their space, but we are also limited by their schedule and their availability, meaning we weren't able to have a lecture every single Tuesday. This year, I have lectures scheduled for every Tuesday from tonight through March 9th. And we have an incredible slate of speakers. I have 9 of our 10 slots currently filled. All 9 of our presentations will be led by folks with some pretty fancy credentials. We have all PhD speakers this year, which is a pretty amazing thing to say when you look at our lineup. Starting tonight, obviously, we're having a lecture about reptiles and amphibians. But next week, we've got another fantastic lecture. We invite Dr. Dan McCarthy from Jacksonville University and Dr. Ken Lindeman from Florida Tech to discuss Florida's nearshore reefs. These are our coastal reefs that are common here in Central Florida. If you've ever been to Bathtub Reef in Stewart, that's the type of reef they're going to be talking about. These are also pretty fragile and imperiled ecosystems. They've recently published a book all about Florida's nearshore reefs, and they are excited to tell us a little bit about their years of research. On January 19th, I'm excited to introduce all of you to Dr. Lorraine Simpson, Florida Oceanographic Society's Director of Scientific Research and Conservation. Dr. Simpson is a mangrove ecologist, and she's going to tell us how mangroves here in Florida have responded to a warming climate. You might be surprised to know that mangroves are on the march. They're heading north. On January 26th, we have a lecture that you absolutely don't want to miss. Our speaker that night, Dr. Kenny Broad, is a professor at the University of Miami. He is also National Geographic's 2011 Explorer of the Year. Kenny is a cave diver and an anthropologist, and his presentation is going to focus on his work diving in the blue holes and cave systems in the Bahamas. This is incredible research. He uses rebreathers to spend hours underwater and underground in these vast limestone caverns. That's definitely one lecture you're going to want to put on your calendar. On February 2nd, our speaker is Dr. Valerie Paul, the head scientist at the Smithsonian Research Station in Fort Pierce. Val's going to talk to us a little bit about the extensive research that Smithsonian is carrying out on the Indian River Lagoon right here in our community, with a real focus on the negative impacts that we've been having on this beautiful and fragile ecosystem. On 2019, Dr. Gordon Patterson, who's a professor at Florida Institute of Technology, is going to teach us about the long history of mosquito control efforts here in Florida. These have ecological implications. We've done a lot of damage to the environment in our attempts to control mosquitoes. They also have some pretty major human health implications, particularly today as we're seeing more and more emerging mosquito-borne diseases occurring. Dr. Stephen Knowles is going to join us on February 16th. He's a master lecturer at the University of Florida. He is going to talk to us about the Cross Florida Barge Canal. I'm sitting here in Stuart tonight. We are at the mouth of the Okeechobee Waterway. That's a man-made canal that cuts all the way across the Florida Peninsula. I bet many of you didn't realize that there were efforts to create a second canal across the state of Florida, a little bit further north. This lecture is going to focus on the history of that project, which thankfully was never taken to fruition. Dr. Robert Knight, the executive director of the Florida Springs Institute, is our speaker for February 23rd. He's going to talk to us a little bit about the threats that are facing Florida's absolutely gorgeous springs. March 2nd is the one date I haven't filled yet, but I promise you we'll have a speaker for March 2nd sooner or later. I'll give you an update at some point. And then finally, our lecture series is going to be wrapped off by Dr. Annie Page Cargin. She's an assistant research professor and clinical veterinarian at Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute. Her research focuses on the health of charismatic megafauna, things like sea turtles, dolphins, and whales, and how these animals are being affected by harmful algae blooms, pollution, contaminants, and infectious diseases. Again, folks, I am super excited with the lineup of speakers we have this year, and I really hope you guys will join us for all 10 of this year's lectures. Unfortunately, I do need you to register for each lecture separately. Even though you've registered for tonight's lecture, I need you to go back into the main lecture series page on our website and register for the remaining 9 presentations. By registering for each presentation, we'll send you a nice reminder email right before the lecture. That way you are sure to join in. The other thing I want to quickly mention are some upcoming events that Florida Oceanographic Society is running. We are offering special guided beach walks on Friday and Sunday mornings during January and February. We also have a series of guided nature trail walks that you can check out. If you're interested, you can register on our website. And then finally, we are offering a really cool program this year. Because of COVID-19, we've decided to offer private single-family tours of the Coastal Center during our closed hours. These tours will give you and your family an opportunity to explore all of our exhibits and feed some of our animals without having to interact with any other members of the public. If you're interested in scheduling a private tour, you can go ahead and email me directly. Now, there's one other thing I want to do before we get started. I know how many people have registered for tonight's talk, but I don't know how many people are actually watching, because I know some of you are watching as a family or as a group. So I'm going to start a poll. If everybody could very quickly just click in and let me know how many people in your group are currently watching. This will give me an idea of our total audience size. This is really important when we report back to our funding agencies at the end of the year to let them know how many people enjoyed watching the lectures that they supported. The Coastal Lecture Series is supported every year by the generosity of the Marmot Foundation. They allow us to provide these lectures free of charge to you. They help some of our speakers with travel expenses when we're doing these in person. And we really appreciate all the support that we get, both from you guys as attendees and from our speakers. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and start our presentation. Now, normally this is the part where I get up on stage and introduce our speaker. But since I'm the speaker tonight, I'm going to skip most of the introduction. I think most of you as regulars probably know a little bit about me. What I do want to tell you is why I'm giving a presentation about reptiles and amphibians. I am a fish ecologist. I primarily study game fish, things like tarpon, snook, bonefish, permit. I also study the places that game fish live, the habitats that they occupy. So why am I giving a talk about reptiles and amphibians? Well, first, a big chunk of my research in the past is focused on the lionfish invasion. So as a fish ecologist, I've done quite a bit of work looking at the spread of the invasive lionfish through the Caribbean and the Western Atlantic. So invasive species are definitely in my wheelhouse. And then separate to that, I've been a reptile hobbyist since I was 8 years old. So for a huge chunk of my life, reptiles and amphibians have been a big part of who I am. I've been keeping and breeding these animals since my childhood. So even though as a researcher, I'm primarily focused on fish, I do have a really strong academic and recreational interest in these species. Now, tonight's talk might be a little bit different than you were expecting. When I originally thought about doing a presentation focused on non-native reptiles and amphibians, my initial concern was that it might turn into a laundry list of species. Here's a python. This is how it got to Florida. This is why that's bad. Here's a tegu. And this is how it got here. And this is why it's bad. And I really don't want to do that. So instead of providing you with a laundry list of all of Florida's not so good reptiles and amphibians, what I want to do instead is use the non-native reptiles and amphibians that live here in Florida as an example of species invasions that are happening all around our globe. So we're going to talk a lot about reptiles and amphibians tonight, but we're also going to talk about invasive species in general. And we may talk about some things that are off your radar. You might be surprised to hear where we're going to go. I have to say my views on invasive species may be a little bit different than other biologists. Ideally, we wouldn't have to deal with non-native species, but there will be points tonight where you realize that my personal views on invasive species maybe aren't as strong as some other folks. I don't always see invasions as being the worst threat to the health of our environment. They're not ideal, and in some cases, they are a pretty huge problem. But I'm going to give you some examples tonight that illustrate the other side of non-native species. To get started, I want to bring up a very important research paper that was published by Dr. Kenny Crisco and a number of his colleagues. He's actually republished this paper several times. Every couple of years, they provide an update on this paper, essentially documenting every single non-native reptile and amphibian species that's ever been documented in Florida over the last 157 years at this point. And that's an awfully large number. They found that Florida has more introduced reptile and amphibian species than anywhere else on planet Earth. So that's a big part of why we're talking about Florida's invasive reptile and amphibians tonight. There are two main reasons why we have so many non-native reptiles and amphibians in Florida. Number one is our climate. Most of Florida is either tropical or subtropical, and those warm climates provide a fantastic home for non-native reptiles from all around the planet to thrive. The other reason that we have so many non-native reptiles and amphibians in our state has to do with the pet trade. For a very long time, the state of Florida has been at the epicenter of the exotic pet trade. There are a number of important export facilities in our state, and that pet trade combined with our climate is a big part of why we have so many non-native reptiles and amphibians in our state. In fact, there are over 180 non-native reptile and amphibian species that have been documented living in Florida at one point or another. Today, 63 of those species are considered established or reproducing in the wild. One of those established species is a crocodilian, 4 of them are frogs, 5 are turtles, 5 are snakes, and 48 are lizards. So we're going to talk a lot about lizards tonight. I don't want you to think I have a particular fascination with lizards. That's just the dominant grouping of non-native reptiles and amphibians that we see here in Florida. I want to get some terminology straight right off the bat. These are terms that we regularly see biologists mixing up. Sometimes I'm guilty of mixing these two terms up. So I want to take a minute to define the word invasive and the word exotic. What exactly is an invasive species? Well, this is the definition that I typically use. It's a kind of a 3-part definition. First, an invasive organism is a species that's introduced to an area where it doesn't naturally occur. That species then has to establish a breeding population. They have to start reproducing in the wild. And then finally, this is the key, they have to spread rapidly and cause severe environmental harm. In my mind, you can't have an invasive species without harm. Just because something is widespread doesn't necessarily mean it's harmful. So what is an exotic species? Well, Florida is home to tons and tons of exotic species that are not invasive. An exotic species is a species that's introduced to an area where it doesn't naturally occur, and it might even start reproducing, but it isn't widespread and it isn't causing environmental harm. This picture on the lower left is a photo that I took when I lived in South Florida. These are green vervet monkeys. There's actually a colony of green vervet monkeys living near the Fort Lauderdale International Airport. They've been there for decades. They are reproducing in the wild. They're thriving, but they're not widespread. They haven't left that area, and they're not causing any environmental harm. So they're a great example of an exotic species, not an invasive species. On the right, we have one of Florida's many non-native parrot species. This particular photo shows a pair of Quaker parakeets. They're probably our most common non-native parrot, but we have dozens of non-native parrots living here. There's actually an interesting story. There's a type of Amazon parrot that's nearly extinct in its native range in Mexico, but it's breeding prolifically here in Florida. There is, or I guess I should say there was, one native parrot species in Florida, the Carolina parakeet. It is completely extinct. So if you see a parrot in Florida today, it's a non-native, it doesn't belong here. But again, we don't have any parrots that I would consider invasive. They're not spreading rapidly and they're not causing environmental harm. Many exotic species never, ever become invasive. In fact, I would say that most exotic species don't become invasive. Additionally, there are some examples of invasive species that are actually native. And that's a little bit of a play on words, but let me explain what I mean. There are some native organisms that for one reason or another start to misbehave. They start to act like an invasive species. The best example I have here in Florida is the cattail. I'm sure most of you know what cattails are. These are the tall, emergent plants that you see growing around the edges of ponds and lakes. They're completely native to Florida. They belong here. But in the last couple of decades, they've started to act like an invasive species, particularly in the Everglades. Historically, the river of grass, the Florida Everglades, was dominated by shallow flooded prairies covered in sawgrass. As Florida has experienced numerous pollution problems from population growth, septic, sewerage, agriculture, water quality in the Everglades has become degraded. We have a nutrient problem. Cattails love nutrients, so throughout the Everglades, there are huge expanses of cattails that have completely displaced our sawgrass. Even though cattails are native, because of our pollution problems, they're starting to act like an invasive species. So I like to refer to cattails in Florida as a native invader. This is a big deal when you think about Everglades restoration. Now, there's another more detailed way of looking at, I guess, the definition of an invasive species. This is a biological invasion model. This is the model that was used in that research paper that I mentioned at the very start of our presentation. It has 6 different stages. In this model, a stage 0 organism is an organism that has not left its home range yet. It's still living where it's supposed to live. In stage 2, we're looking at potential invaders that have become transported to a new area, but they get intercepted without ever becoming introduced to the wild. So a stage 1 organism would be something like a suitcase full of tortoises that gets intercepted at the airport by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. A stage 2 organism is a potential invader that survives transport, escapes into the wild or is released into the wild, and becomes introduced. So they're now considered a non-indigenous or non-native species. By stage 3, we're looking at non-indigenous species that have survived and become established. That means they are reproducing in the wild. This would be like the green vervet monkeys or the parrots that we looked at earlier. In stage 3, though, these animals are still uncommon, not very abundant, and relatively localized. When we get to stage 4 and stage 5, this is where we start to think of invasive species. In stage 4, we have non-indigenous species that are either widespread but relatively uncommon, or extremely common in a relatively small number of areas, geographically speaking. And then in stage 5, we have animals that are both widespread and very dominant. That's where we get into big trouble. You'll notice that this model does not talk about ecological harm. Again, in my mind, as an ecologist, I think you have to look at harm before you label an animal as invasive. There are animals that are widespread, and plants as well, that aren't really causing dramatic environmental harm. It's still not a good thing, but it's not nearly as bad as something that's causing measurable harm. And as you'll see a little bit later on, it's oftentimes difficult to measure environmental harm. So make sure when you think about an animal, you're separating exotic from invasive, and you understand that to really become invasive, there has to be some component of environmental harm. When we think of the worst invasive species, we often think about predators, animals at the top of the food chain. In this case, we're looking at a picture of the brown tree snake. Brown tree snakes are native to certain islands in the South Pacific. They were accidentally introduced to Guam in the years following World War II. What probably happened is as US troops were pulling out of the Pacific theater, they were moving vehicles and cargo and shipping containers back to Guam as sort of a centralized location. And at some point, these brown tree snakes hitched a ride. There were no native snakes to Guam. There were no predators in Guam that could control the brown tree snake. And as a result, they very quickly spread throughout the island, and they have resulted in the near extinction or extinction of a whole bunch of different bird and lizard species that were historically native to Guam. So the brown tree snake is a great example of a typical scary predatory invasive species. But in my field, as a marine ecologist, most of our really bad invasive species aren't that scary. In fact, prior to the lionfish invasion, which I'm going to talk about a lot tonight, as a lionfish researcher, you're going to hear a lot about lionfish, even though it's a reptile presentation. But prior to the lionfish invasion, most invasive marine organisms were little dinky critters. They were crabs and mussels, clams, snails, even vegetation. That's unique to the marine world. And honestly, even today, I would say that the lionfish is one of the only examples of a widespread marine invasive predator. That's not the case in terrestrial ecosystems. A lot of our really bad terrestrial invasive species are big, charismatic predators like the Burmese python. And these big, charismatic predators make for good news stories. That's why most of you are so familiar with Florida's python problem, but you might not be as aware of some of the other non-native reptiles and amphibians that we're going to talk about tonight. Pythons sell. This is a recent news story that I saw proclaiming that a new record python has been caught in Florida. If you read the fine print, the new record was only 1/10 of an inch bigger than the previous record. This particular snake was 18 feet 0.9 or 18.9 feet long. The previous record was 18.8 feet long. As a scientist, stories like this don't really mean much to me. It's not that important that a slightly bigger python was found in the Everglades. But for news networks, these stories become national headlines. That's the same reason that most of you know a lot about the lionfish invasion. I would guess that most of you, even if you're not from Florida, have heard about the lionfish. The lionfish story has been shared broadly. It's a unique story. It's a very important story. But I have to tell you that the lionfish problem is not nearly as big as we thought it was originally going to be. Because lionfish are charismatic, they're attractive, they have a unique story, they're venomous, they're really pretty, gregarious fish, they're popular in the pet trade, they become a popular news story. That doesn't mean that they're the worst invasive species. In fact, many of the worst invasive species aren't what you think they are. But here in Florida, we do have some pretty scary invasive species. In my mind, these are 4 of our worst invaders from the perspective of being big and scary. In the upper left, we have the Burmese python. Burmese pythons are a threat because they are top predators. In Florida, Burmese pythons have been found to eat just about every native vertebrate species you can think of that lives in their invasive range. They've eaten deer, raccoons, opossums, bobcats, foxes, alligators, wading birds, you name it, it's probably been found in the belly of a python. The next two are lizards. In the upper right, we have an Argentine black and white tegu. In the lower left, we have a Nile monitor. Both of these lizards are predators, but they're primarily predators of eggs. These lizards dig up buried nests and consume the eggs of other animals. That's a big problem in Florida because we have some really rare animals that lay eggs. I'm thinking of things like the American crocodile, the American alligator, gopher tortoises, even burrowing owls have been affected by tegus and monitors. So predators, but predators primarily of eggs. And then in the lower right, we have the cane toad or the marine toad. Now, these aren't necessarily big, scary predators, but they are fairly big. They're abundant, and they're pretty well known by people here in Florida. I'm not worried about cane toads because they're predators. I'm concerned about cane toads because they are toxic. They create a very strong poison called bufotoxin in those glands that you see behind their eyeballs. And I'll talk more about bufotoxin a little bit later. But that's one of the reasons why cane toads are in this list of the top 4 charismatic, scary predators that have invaded Florida. One of the unique things about the cane toad is they've been in Florida much longer than the other 3 species on this slide. When I was little, I remember going outside on rainy nights and seeing literally hundreds of cane toads hopping around. Today, I don't see them very often, and that's because they're further along in their invasion. When we look at species invasions, whether we're talking about plants or animals, we often see a similar pattern. Early in the invasion, there are very few individuals in the invaded area. And during that time, eradication efforts might work. If you catch an invasion early enough, when there's just a handful of organisms in a new area, you might be able to stop that species from proliferating. That phase, that lag phase, can last years sometimes. There are examples of animals that got to Florida a really long time ago and are only starting to explode today. But eventually, animals that are destined to become invasive often experience a sudden increase in population size, an exponential increase. Once that population peaks, it's pretty common to see a decrease. And eventually you end up with kind of a stable middle ground. Cane toads are in that stable phase. They've already peaked, and today they're less common than they once were. That may have something to do with predation. It's possible that some predators here in North America have started eating cane toads. It's also possibly related to diseases or parasites. In many examples, we're seeing invasions that aren't as bad as they once were. That's a pretty typical part of the invasion process. For Burmese pythons, tegus, and monitors, they are still in the exponential phase of their invasion. It's important to know, though, that not all of the big and scary invasive species here in Florida are actually big and scary. In fact, I would argue that some of the worst invasive species in our state are not pythons and tegus, they're trees. On this slide, I've got a couple of our really scary invasive tree species. On the left, we have the Brazilian pepper. This is an ornamental plant that was introduced from South America. It's actually in the same genus as the plant that produces edible pink peppercorns. In the middle is the Australian pine or casuarina. They came from Australia and were primarily planted around farms and homesteads to create a windbreak or a wind block. On the right is a species of Melaleuca tree. This is a type of eucalyptus that came from Australia, as did the Australian pine. They were planted as wind blocks, but they also did something else. Their roots work like sponges. So Melaleuca trees were planted in wet areas to dry up the soil, essentially wiping out wetlands. All 3 of these trees utilize an ecological process called allelopathy. Allelopathy refers to a form of biological warfare where a tree or a plant produces toxins in its leaves. And when those leaves fall to the ground, they prevent other species from sprouting and growing. It eliminates all competition. In the middle photo, you can see allelopathy pretty clearly. Around that Australian pine, you can see a brown layer of needles on the ground. Those pine needles are toxic to other plants. No plants can grow around casuarina except for other casuarina. And that's why we see huge monocultures of Brazilian pepper, Australian pine, and Melaleuca growing in Florida. They even grow in protected areas like Everglades National Park. Some of the most expensive invasive species eradication efforts that have ever been undertaken in Florida involve eradicating these three species of not so scary tree. In addition to not so scary trees, we have some not so scary insects that are horrible invaders. On the left is the emerald ash borer. It's a tiny beetle that was introduced from Asia, and it is devastating ash forests throughout the eastern and midwestern United States. I have some family in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Last year, I drove all the way across the state of Pennsylvania, and I was sickened by the devastation that I saw as I drove. There were thousands and thousands of acres of standing dead ash trees that had recently been killed by this tiny beetle. They bore into the bark of ash trees and they cut off the tree's water supply. So the trees essentially lose their water supply and die. In the middle, we have another tiny insect, the woolly hemlock adelgid. These are a sap-sucking insect, kind of like an aphid. They are devastating hemlock forests in the Northeast. There are hemlock trees that have been alive for hundreds of years, old growth hemlocks that have somehow been protected from logging, and now they're dying all because of a tiny insect that was accidentally introduced from Asia. And then finally, in the far right, if you're from Florida, you know what these are. These are fire ants, another absolutely horrible invasive species that was introduced from Argentina by accident. Again, sometimes our worst invaders are little tiny things. Let's go even tinier. Some of our worst invaders are microscopic, things like fungi. On this slide, on the left, we have chestnut blight. On the right, we have Dutch elm disease. These are two different species of fungi that were accidentally introduced from Europe and Asia, and they completely changed what North America's forests look like. These two fungal invaders have completely wiped out elm trees and chestnut trees throughout the United States. Tiny, tiny organism, unbelievably large impact across a huge geographical area. Pythons are a big deal, but something like chestnut blight has had a far bigger impact, even though it's microscopic. And then we've got our invasive species that just seem too cute and cuddly to be a big problem. Things like wild pigs and feral cats. Most scientists would agree that feral cats are the worst invasive species on Earth. Just in the United States, they estimate that outdoor cats kill more than 2 billion songbirds, billion with a B, every single year. Around the world, that number is even higher. And then pigs are a huge problem here in Florida. These are not native pigs. There are native pigs in parts of Florida, or not parts of Florida, parts of the United States, sorry. Particularly in the desert Southwest, there are things like javelinas and peccaries that are supposed to be in America. These pigs in Florida aren't native. They're just barnyard pigs that were introduced by early Spanish settlers 300, 400, 500 years ago. They've established themselves in Florida. They've bred and they've taken over huge areas, and they are devastating. If you've ever been hiking in Florida and seen an area that's torn up, that almost looks like somebody drove a bulldozer through it, but there aren't any bulldozer tracks, you are looking at the damage that a group of wild pigs can inflict. They dig up the forest looking for food, and what they leave behind looks like a bomb crater. Huge, huge invader, but at face value, they really don't look so bad. So when we think about invasive species, whether we're looking at reptiles and amphibians or any invasive species, we have to think about what traits make them so successful. And there are a pretty conserved set of traits that many invasive species possess. First, most invasive species have been introduced more than one time, and this has to do with genetic diversity. If an invasive species is only introduced once, even if it spreads and reproduces, it doesn't have a whole lot of genetic diversity. We refer to that as a genetic bottleneck. In their native range, they've got lots of different family trees. If they've only been introduced once, their family tree is pretty small, and that lack of genetics can have big implications in terms of their success. If you introduce a species multiple times over the years, each time it gets reintroduced, there's some new genetics being brought into that invaded area, and that can cause that species to become a more successful invader. Most invasive species reproduce frequently, produce a huge number of eggs or offspring, and they oftentimes have unique dispersal mechanisms. They're able to spread out really well. They also tend to grow very quickly. Slow-growing organisms like tortoises aren't your typical invasive species. Things that grow and reach maturity in a short period of time tend to be a better invader. Additionally, a lot of invasive species aren't very picky about where they live or what they eat. They're considered generalists rather than specialists. Next, quite a few non-native species have unique or novel behaviors or unusual defensive mechanisms. Finally, in areas where successful invasive animals set up shop, we tend to see a pattern where the native species are naive about the invader. Our native predators don't recognize the invader as a threat. Our native prey species don't recognize the invader as food. And we're going to talk more about these last 2 points in a second here. So first, I want to think about novel defense mechanisms. Lots of successful invasive species have a few tricks up their sleeve that protect them from predation. We talked about allelopathy. I guess that would be an example of a defense mechanism in a plant. In my research, I obviously think about lionfish and their defense mechanism. They've got those crazy venomous spines. We don't have any fish in our part of the world that have that type of defense mechanism. Even our native scorpion fish, which are close cousins of the lionfish, don't have quite as advanced of a venom delivery system as the lionfish do. So that defense mechanism keeps lionfish safe from predators. In this picture, we've got the cane toad or the marine toad. As I mentioned before, they have a really strong toxin called bufotoxin, and that poison is produced in those glands that you see on the side of the toad's head. Cane toads are deadly. If a predator eats a cane toad, there's a very good chance that it's going to die. In North America, we have other native toad species that produce bufotoxins, but they're not nearly as toxic as the cane toad's toxins. Many of our toad-eating species are vulnerable to cane toads, even though they can eat our native toads. And I want to tell you, our native toads are beneficial. They're good to have around. Toads are great animals as long as it's not the cane toad. Our native toad-eating animals, like the hognose snake, for example, are vulnerable to eating the non-native cane toad. It's an even bigger problem in Australia. Australia doesn't have anything like the cane toad that's native, so their predators are completely ill-equipped to handle that toxin. Cane toads have decimated populations of all different types of predators in Australia. So defense mechanisms are one thing, and that kind of leads us to our next topic, predator naivete or enemy release. Many non-native predators aren't recognized by native species, and many non-native prey animals also aren't recognized by native species. So if you have a non-native organism that gets introduced to an area, you might think that native predators will be able to take care of that invasion. But there are many examples of our native predators failing to recognize the invasive species as food, or maybe in the case of the cane toad, they're just not able to successfully consume it because it's protected. Again, back to the lionfish. Lionfish look so different than any other native fish. Most of our big predatory fish don't look at them as food. Even fish like grouper and sharks that could easily eat lionfish aren't really eating them, not because they're venomous, but primarily because they look like a dish rag underwater. They don't look like food. So when an invasive animal is freed up from being eaten by predators, we say that it's experiencing enemy release. It doesn't have to worry about getting eaten, so it's able to eat and breed and reproduce without, without the extra strain of having to hide from predators. As a result, they're able to grow and reproduce really quickly. In fact, many non-native species are larger in their invaded range than in their native range. Back to lionfish once again. The largest lionfish ever caught have consistently come out of the Atlantic and the Caribbean rather than the Indo-Pacific where they're native to. That's because of enemy release and predator naivete. In addition to predators, these invasive species could also be released from worrying about diseases and parasites. And those are two really important points. Many invasive species don't have to deal with the diseases and parasites that they do in their home range. A similar topic is prey naivete. If you're an invasive predator and you're very different than any native predators, native prey species don't realize you're a threat. This is a veiled chameleon. They are breeding in certain parts of Florida. We don't have any native lizards that are anything like a veiled chameleon. This is a big lizard with incredible camouflage, really great behavior as a predator. They're hard to see. They don't move very quickly. They've got a huge tongue. As a native prey species, how do you deal with an animal like the veiled chameleon that you have no evolutionary history of dealing with? That is an example of prey naivete. Predator naivete and prey naivete are both really important components when we think about why invasive species are so successful. Now, this is a unique picture. I wanted to share this with you. I don't know whether this is an example of predator naivete or prey naivete. What you're looking at is a huge Burmese python that tried to eat an alligator. Obviously, it wasn't successful. The alligator was still alive when it was swallowed and was able to kick its way out of the python's belly. Is this an example of an alligator not realizing that the python is a predator, is a threat? Or is it an example of an alligator that might have been able to eat that python, but it didn't realize it was food? I just want to show this to you because it really underscores how complicated our topic is today. And in reality, tonight's presentation, it's just the tip of the iceberg on this topic. You could do an entire semester-long college course on invasive reptiles and amphibians in 1 hour. I'm barely gonna cover the basics, but hopefully you guys will still come away with a new understanding of the problem. And I'm actually hopeful that you'll come up with some new questions and some new thoughts about invasive species in general. Next, I want to think about invasion pathways. How an animal gets from its native range to its invaded range. Sometimes these pathways are really clear, sometimes they're not. Let's go back to my lionfish friend. There have been a number of speculated pathways for the lionfish invasion. Most of them are completely wrong. The story I hear mentioned most often is that Hurricane Andrew knocked over an aquarium into Biscayne Bay, and that is how the lionfish invasion began. It's completely wrong. That's not true at all. That's not what happened. The scientist who published that paper retracted his statement. The reason we know that's not the case is twofold. Number one, lionfish were in Florida long before Hurricane Andrew. Number two, genetic studies have shown that lionfish in the Atlantic are far more diverse than you would ever expect if just a few individuals were dumped out of a fish tank. Another story I've heard is that the Atlantis Aquarium in the Bahamas released some lionfish or lionfish eggs. Again, our population is far too diverse to come from a single source. What about ship ballast water? Big cargo ships fill their bellies with water so they travel more smoothly in rough seas. And then when they get to port, they dump all that water out. Many marine invasive species have been transferred through ship ballast tanks, but not lionfish. They're too sensitive. They can't survive in that environment. Things like barnacles, zebra mussels, clams, they can survive in a ship's ballast water, not lionfish. This last one presents kind of a conundrum for me. There were some rumors circulating that scuba diving tour operators may have intentionally released lionfish onto Florida's reefs because our reefs were in such rough shape, there weren't that many pretty fish for their customers to look at. I'm hopeful that this isn't true, but it's the very first of several weird ethical conversations that you're going to hear me bring up tonight. How did lionfish get to Florida? They came through the pet trade. Lionfish are a very popular aquarium fish. They're beautiful, they're charismatic, they're fun to have, they're expensive, but they also get pretty big and sometimes they eat your other fish. In the past, it wasn't too uncommon for aquarists to get tired of their lionfish. Rather than euthanizing their pets, they decided that it would be better to just let them go. Today, we know that that's not a good thing to do. Most pet owners today are responsible. They're not letting their pets go anymore. This is a relic of poor decisions from the past. People let these go, one here, one there, and you think that wouldn't lead to an invasion, but over time, enough lionfish were released in Florida that they found each other, they started reproducing, and they went from that kind of lingering low population to an exponential increase, and that's how we got where we are today. We're going to talk a lot about the pet trade in our lecture tonight. Now, I have another really interesting story about invasions. This is one of my favorite ways that animals can get from point A to B because it's entirely natural. There are a number of examples of natural population expansions. In this case, I want to talk about the black-bellied whistling duck and the cattle egret. The map on the left in yellow shows where black-bellied whistling ducks are found today, all around the Gulf Coast and Southeast. Prior to 1950, they were incredibly rare in the United States. They were primarily a Central American species, occasionally ranging into Texas. They're pretty widespread today. A colleague of mine, a good friend of mine actually, is a waterfowl biologist, and he's found black-bellied whistling ducks as far as Illinois. This map was produced by the Audubon Society to show what might happen to some of these natural range expansions if Earth's climate warms up by 3 degrees. So in the blue, you can see how widespread black-bellied whistling ducks will become if North America's climate warms up just a little bit. They're going to just creep north further and further. On the right, we have an even more controversial species, the cattle egret. Cattle egrets were completely absent from North America prior to 1952. As you can see in the yellow, they're really widespread today. And if our climate warms up a little bit, they're going to be even more widespread. There are many people that consider cattle egrets an invasive species, but they're not. They were never part of the pet trade. They weren't hitchhiking on container ships or cargo boats. I think they somehow got here naturally. They came from Africa, and in one way or another, they were able to make an incredible migration to South America. And in my opinion, they probably got here on their own. We didn't have to help them. And in the last half century, they've marched north all the way into the southern half almost of North America. Natural range expansions, in my opinion, are not an example of species invasions. When we start to think about Florida's invasive reptile and amphibians, there are a number of ways that they were introduced. First, I want to start with truly accidental introductions. About 10% of Florida's non-native reptile and amphibian species got here totally accidentally, usually related to shipping and commerce. These are hitchhikers. I have 3 pictures of non-native reptiles and amphibians here in Florida that were introduced accidentally. On the left is the greenhouse frog. These showed up in Dade County as early as the 1960s. They were introduced from Cuba. In the middle is the brown anole, the most common lizard here in Florida. They've been here since the 1880s. They arrived on ships coming from Cuba and the Bahamas. And finally, on the right is the Cuban tree frog, the largest tree frog in Florida. They arrived as early as the 1920s from Cuba. These species have been here forever. They've been here for a really long time. Even though they're non-native, they have become a part of our Florida ecosystems. They are prey for some animals, they're predators for other animals. I wish they weren't here, but they are functioning as part of our ecosystems. This also underscores just how much international trade there was between the Caribbean and Florida in the late 1800s. Next, I want to look at intentional introductions that weren't part of the pet trade. And there's only 2 examples of reptiles and amphibians that were introduced intentionally to Florida. These were usually introduced to control agricultural pests. They were an example of a biological control method. I'll tell you, they didn't work very well. One of them is the cane toad. Cane toads were brought to Florida initially in the 1930s to control pests in our sugarcane fields. They were also reintroduced a number of times through the pet trade later on. So it's not a clear-cut biological control invasion, but that was how they first arrived here. This is also the same way that northern curly-tail lizards got here from the Bahamas in the 1930s. They were released to control agricultural pests, but like the cane toad, they were subsequently released over and over again through the pet trade. Some of these introduction pathways aren't very clear. That brings us to the pet trade. This is obviously the most controversial topic tonight. It's the most important topic to me as somebody who keeps reptiles as pets. This is a pretty big deal. 86% of the non-native reptiles and amphibians that live in Florida were introduced through the pet trade, both accidentally and intentionally. I want to start with intentional releases. There's a little bit of a dark underbelly to this story. There have been examples of intentional releases of very expensive reptiles, particularly chameleons, giant day geckos, by reptile breeders. Reptiles breed better in the wild than they do in captivity. So enterprising reptile breeders decided that they were going to let some of these expensive animals go, let them start breeding in the wild, and then come back and harvest their offspring. On the left, this is an Austerlitz chameleon that I collected from an avocado grove in South Florida. In the middle is a Madagascar giant day gecko that I collected in the Florida Keys. On the right is a panther chameleon. These are one of several chameleon species that have been introduced intentionally into Florida. The chameleon on the left and the day gecko in the middle, they sell for about $100 each. The chameleon on the right is worth $600 to $800. People are releasing these on purpose, specifically to harvest their offspring. Not a great story, definitely doesn't make the reptile industry look very positive. There are also examples of accidental introductions by pet owners, kind of like the lionfish introduction story. Over the years, people have purchased cute little red ear slider turtles or cute little green iguanas. They may be cute when they're little, but they're a handful. They're hard to take care of and they live for a very long time. In the past, rather than euthanizing these pets, people just let them go. And that's a big part of why we see so many red ear slider turtles and green iguanas in South Florida today. I am optimistic that most pet owners aren't doing this anymore. Most pet owners realize how big of a problem invasive species are, and I'm hopeful that they are doing a better job of finding a new home for their pets if they are no longer able to care for them. And then there are examples of accidental pet releases. These usually aren't caused by pet owners. Most pet owners, if you lose your pet tortoise or your pet snake, you're going to do everything you can to recapture your beloved pet. Most accidental releases occur at reptile breeders or reptile wholesalers. In fact, that research paper that we started our presentation with by Dr. Crisco and his colleagues documented one single reptile and amphibian importer in Hollywood, Florida, that might be responsible for 1/4 of all of the introduced reptile and amphibian species found in Florida. They're not intentionally releasing these animals to reharvest them, like I mentioned a minute ago, but they're handling lots and lots of animals, and sometimes things escape. Hopefully they're doing a better job today than they were in the past. These animals are expensive. They don't want to lose livestock, but for a long time, they ran fast and loose. And as a result, animals like the tokay gecko on the left, the green basilisk with the crest, the Cuban nightingale second to the right, and the rainbow whiptail, among many, many others, have appeared in South Florida, particularly around areas where there are reptile-related businesses. So this brings us to the most important question tonight. What are the impacts of these invasive reptiles and amphibians here in Florida? What are the ecological consequences? This is important because remember earlier I said we really have to think about whether these animals are causing harm or not. And ecological consequences aren't always clear. There are a couple of things that non-native reptile and amphibians have been shown to do. In some cases, they compete with native species. If that competition is strong enough, they might actually completely displace native animals, push them out of a geographical area. They may also directly eat native species. Think about the Burmese python. There are other impacts too. They may transmit parasites. They may be poisonous and may poison our native species. So that's kind of a tough part of our story to wrap our heads around. I want to talk about this little lizard as we begin to think about the ecological impacts of invasive species. This is a green anole. This is Florida's original native anole species. If you've been in Florida for more than, let's say, 30 years, you remember these as a pretty abundant lizard. They were all over the place. Today, I almost never see green anoles. I typically only see them out in the middle of nowhere. I do see a lot of brown anoles. And unfortunately, I also see brown anoles in the middle of nowhere, miles from human habitation. Brown anoles have effectively spread all throughout Florida. And for a long time, as green anoles disappeared, scientists thought that the brown anoles had completely pushed them out of parts of South Florida. But that's not the case. There are scientists now studying the interaction between green anoles and brown anoles, and what they found is pretty interesting. These scientists generally work on small islands, both here in the Indian River Lagoon and in the Bahamas. They've removed anoles from those islands and then reintroduced green and brown anoles and tracked their populations over time. It turns out when brown anoles show up, the green anoles don't disappear, they go higher up in the trees. They become more arboreal. And there's more to it than that. Brown anoles can actually cause evolutionary changes in green anoles. And let me explain what I mean. When brown anoles show up, green anoles go up the trees. The green anoles that already have maybe slightly longer toes or slightly stickier toes, they do better than their neighbors. By doing better, they're able to thrive and grow and reproduce, and they pass on their genes that code for longer, stickier toes to the next generation. So each generation of green anoles in areas where brown anoles exist do better in trees, they grow longer toes and stickier toes. Within about 20 generations, green anoles have completely different feet than they did prior to the brown anoles showing up. So instead of displacing green anoles, brown anoles are just forcing green anoles to move to a different part of the ecosystem. They're going up instead of away. Next, we have to think about invasive species eating our native species. This is a 15-foot Burmese python with a 75-pound white-tailed deer in its belly. There is very strong evidence to suggest that Burmese pythons might be having a negative impact on large vertebrates in the Everglades, things like rabbits, raccoons, foxes, armadillos, opossums, alligators even. Scientists have conducted road surveys for a number of years, counting the number of small furry animals that they see sitting on the side of the road. In the last 2 decades or so, they've seen a 99% decrease in certain species like rabbits. They are attributing those declines to the arrival of the Burmese python. And that may be true, but please remember, in the last 2 decades, the health of the Everglades is also declining. So you may be seeing the impacts of the python invasion. You may also be seeing a combination of pythons plus the destruction that humans have wreaked on the Everglades in the last couple of decades. Sometimes it's very hard to tell whether the invasive species is really causing problems or whether they're just exacerbating an existing problem. Pictures like this are pretty compelling though. Not all predators are 15 feet long. This is a Cuban tree frog eating one of our native tree frogs. Invasive predators are a problem whether they're big or tiny. This is a really good example of a small and not so scary predator that actually has a pretty substantial impact on the environment. Next, we have to think about invaders as potential vectors for parasite transfer. The little frog on the left is an African clawed frog. That little frog is responsible for the largest amphibian extinctions on planet Earth. That little frog introduced a non-native fungus called Chytridiomycosis. That fungus is killing amphibians globally. This is why we've seen a horrible amphibian die-off throughout Central America and South America, among other places. In the middle, we have a pygmy rattlesnake with lungworms coming out of its mouth. These are parasitic worms that live in a snake's lungs. There are native lungworms here in Florida, but this particular lungworm that you're looking at is not native. It's from Southeast Asia. Scientists think that this type of lungworm got here in Burmese pythons, and the pythons are actually serving as a lungworm factory, for a lack of better words, and they are spreading those lungworms to our native snakes. And then on the right, we have a milk snake that's infected with a terrible disease called snake fungal disease that in recent years is rapidly spreading across the United States. Now, there is no definitive proof that invasive species have brought snake fungal disease to the United States, but there's a pretty good chance that that's why we're seeing it. We'll learn more about snake fungal disease in the future. Now, I want to pose a really unique ethical question for you guys as we get close to the end of our presentation tonight. Are all introduced species bad? And I think you know where I'm at with this. I don't think they are all terrible. In some cases, non-native species are filling vacant niches in certain ecosystems rather than displacing our native species. Back to my lionfish as an example, there used to be a lot of very small grouper that lived on our coral reefs, things like graysbees, conies, rock hind. A lot of those grouper have disappeared because of overfishing. Those grouper live in the exact same habitats as lionfish. They live in caves and under ledges. So when lionfish appeared, they actually filled some of those vacant spots out on the reef. Not that lionfish are good, but they may be providing some sort of benefit for the reef that we're just not able to see right now. On this slide, there's a much better example. This bird is the snail kite. Very, very rare bird in the United States, federally protected, and all they eat is the apple snail. They use their curved beak to pull apple snails out of their shell. Unfortunately, in recent years, our native apple snail populations have declined, and as a result, snail kite populations are declining. Some of that decline may also have to do with the health of the Everglades. Our water quality is not what it once was. We've lost nesting habitats, but certainly the decline in apple snail populations is a big issue. On the right, we see the channeled apple snail. This is an invasive apple snail. We actually have several invasive apple snails living in Florida. They get enormous. And for a long time, they were considered an aquatic pest. They were lawnmowers of freshwater ecosystems, eating our native aquatic plants. But scientists started to realize that the snail kite was able to eat invasive apple snails. And as a result, we've seen snail kite numbers increase. We've seen their body mass increase. We've even seen their nesting success go up. A lot of that might be due to this non-native or invasive, really, snail. So this is a pretty good example of a non-native species that doesn't belong here. I wish it wasn't here, but it's having a kind of a unique positive effect for the snail kite. Next, I want to think about eradication efforts. We know we've got invasive species here. How do we get rid of them? Well, this poster is pretty emblematic of our struggle, wanted dead or alive. When we look at reptiles and amphibians, there are some invaders that are wanted dead. There are others that are more valuable alive. Pythons are an example of an animal that, generally speaking, are euthanized when they're found. They don't really have any value, monetary value as a living animal, but their skin has a value. In addition, there's a bounty on them. So when python hunters go out and kill pythons in the Everglades, they're able to make an income by doing that. That is their only incentive for removing them from the wild. If they didn't have a cash value, nobody would devote their time to killing them. However, there are a lot of reptiles and amphibians that are worth more alive. Things like tegus, chameleons, geckos. We talked about these earlier as being pretty valuable in the pet trade. Most people who collect tegus, chameleons, and geckos aren't doing it out of the kindness of their heart. They're doing it to make money. If those animals had no value, they wouldn't be out collecting them. Now, there's a unique tool that scientists are using to try to eradicate pythons in the Everglades. They call it the Trojan snake method. It's a lot easier to catch small male pythons than large female pythons. So researchers are implanting little tracking tags inside of male Burmese pythons, and those male pythons, they have an amazing nose and tongue, and they're able to track down breeding females. Scientists follow the males right to the breeding female, and they're able to euthanize the female and prevent her from breeding. So it's a kind of a neat technique. Additionally, there are a lot of invasive species roundups here in Florida. unfortunately, they really don't work. It's great to go out and teach people how to catch non-native reptiles and send them out with, a bag and a snake hook to try to catch pythons, for example. But in almost every case, these efforts are too little too late. Remember that curve I showed you earlier? The only time that you can eradicate a non-native species is before it starts to grow exponentially. Most of the species that are being eradicated in Florida are along too far to be successfully eradicated. Now, there are some weird unintended consequences of these efforts to eradicate reptiles and amphibians in Florida. When you create a market for a non-native organism, people start to do some weird things. Let's go back to our very expensive $600 panther chameleon. There are stories of chameleon collectors intentionally leaving the big adult chameleons out in the wild and only collecting the juveniles that do better in captive husbandry. They're leaving the adults so that they can continue to reproduce, even though they're a non-native organism. The same thing's happening with lionfish. I've heard a number of stories of lionfish spear fishermen who sell these lionfish for their fillets, passing up small lionfish to allow them to grow to a harvestable size. That's not what we want. When you're trying to eradicate a non-native species, you want to remove all of them from the wild. I belong to a number of reptile and amphibian websites and message boards, and it's shocking to hear how often you hear people complaining about folks removing too many chameleons from the wild. Oh, it's a shame that so many are collected. It's a shame that people are so greedy. Let's leave these out in the wild. This is a non-native species. They don't belong in Florida at all. Nobody should be praising efforts to protect a non-native chameleon. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about our native predators. You'd like to think that native predators might be able to eradicate some of our invaders. This is a picture of an alligator eating a python. On the other side is a red-shouldered hawk eating an agama. Folks, it's not going to happen. We don't have as many predators in the United States as we once did. We just don't have the numbers that would be required to control invasive species. Additionally, as we talked about earlier, a lot of our invaders have tricks up their sleeve to prevent themselves from being eaten by native predators. Next, I want to quickly talk about genetics issues. I mentioned earlier that most successful invasions occur when an animal is released multiple times, so they've got lots of genetic diversity. If an organism is only released one time, there's a good chance that it's not very diverse in the invaded range. Let's think about the Burmese python. Imagine if you went to Asia, where Burmese pythons are from, you would find them across a broad range of areas. Some of those pythons might have genetics that allow them to live in very warm climates. Some of those pythons might have genetics that allow them to live in cooler areas. If pythons were only introduced to Florida once, and the only population of pythons that came over from Asia were not tolerant of cold weather, those pythons wouldn't be able to spread north out of Florida. If, however, pythons were introduced multiple times and there were some individuals that were able to live in cooler areas and some individuals that were able to live in warmer areas, there's the risk that that genetic diversity might allow pythons to spread outside of Florida. Unfortunately, a lot of invaders are pretty diverse from a genetics perspective in their invaded range. Take, for example, the brown anole. Scientists figured that brown anoles here in Florida would not be as genetically diverse as they are in their native range. Turns out that's not the case. Brown anoles in Florida are just as genetically diverse as they are in their home territory. Now, we talked a few minutes ago about non-native predators impacting the genetics of native species. That was the story of the brown anoles making the toes on green anoles grow longer. But can we as humans cause natural selection to occur on invasive predators? Absolutely. When we go out to harvest non-native species, oftentimes we are picking the easy ones to catch. We're picking the lionfish that are out in the open. We're killing the pythons that are just laying on a trail, the easy ones. As a result, we're seeing these animals becoming more and more cryptic. They're hiding more. They're harder to see. They're harder to find. Imagine if all of your pythons looked like this python, barely visible, hiding under the water. We're starting to see it with lionfish. In areas where lionfish have been heavily harvested, instead of seeing them out in the open, they're starting to hide more. They're up in ledges and caves. They're not as easy to see. They're more nocturnal. We don't know whether that is just a behavioral change. Those individuals have learned that humans are bad and they're hiding from us, or a genetic change. Think about it this way. If you kill off all of the dumb, slow, easy to find animals, the ones that are left are camouflage. They're nocturnal. They're better at hiding. They then reproduce and pass their genetics on to the next generation. So each generation gets harder and harder for us to eradicate. Finally, the last topic I'm going to cover today before we wrap up is the trickiest. Laws and legislation designed at controlling the importation, the ownership, and the breeding of reptiles and amphibians. Here in Florida, there are laws that govern your ability to own certain large reptiles. In many cases, you have to have a special permit, certain training, and those animals typically have to have a microchip in them. That's a good thing. But as a reptile owner, I have to tell you, I'm a little bit leery about certain pieces of legislation geared at controlling the ownership of reptiles, primarily because they won't work. It's one thing to control an animal that might eventually become a risk, but there's no reason to make it illegal to own an animal that's already invasive. People can own Burmese pythons as much as they want. It's not going to make Florida's Burmese python problem any worse. And here's why. Most python owners today aren't dumping their pythons out in the Everglades. We know better. This is a problem that happened decades ago, and we're just now seeing the results of it. So really, we need to think about preventing future invasions, but without reducing incentives for removing invasive species from the wild. Think about it this way. These are black and white Argentine tegus. The only reason that anybody would remove a tegu from the wild is to sell it into the pet trade. That's the only value of a tegu. And lots of people do this. So it's good. It's taking them out of the wild. We hope that the people that buy those tegus would never release them back into the wild again. If you made it illegal to own a tegu here in Florida, nobody would bother to catch them. Nobody's doing this out of the kindness of their heart. It's all about dollars. So any legislation that is aimed at preventing future invasions has to take into account that that legislation might have a negative impact accidentally. We need to target species that have the potential to have an ecological impact and also that have traits that might make them more likely to become an invasive. The problem is it's really hard to predict what the next invasive species is going to be. So in my mind, we have to focus on education. We have to make sure that our pet owners aren't letting these animals go. To me, education is far more important than legislation. Now, I have one more slide, but I want to make sure, Michelle, is our program going to cut right off at 7:45, or are we going to go a little bit longer? I have some help listening in the background. I just want to check and make sure we have a little bit of extra time. Let me see. I don't know if Michelle's going to answer me verbally or in the comments box. Let's see here. Well, I guess I'm going to keep talking. Hopefully we don't get cut off. If we do get cut off, I'm going to see you guys in a week, and we'll pick up right where we left off with our next presenter. Hopefully we won't get cut off at our 7:45 end of program. The last thing I want to talk to you about, again, I'm going to emphasize that last point one more time. Fixing species invasions, whether we're talking about reptiles, amphibians, or anything, goldfish, plants, it's all about education, not legislation. We need to make sure people are not releasing things into the wild anymore. Thankfully, I think most pet owners are more responsible today than they were years ago. As I've said previously, the problems we're seeing in Florida today are a legacy of past introductions. And I'm going to illustrate that with my final slide. I want to talk to you about some of the invasive species that live right here at the Florida Oceanographic Coastal Center. We have a 57-acre property, and unfortunately, I see far more non-native species on a day-to-day basis than native species. We do have some native reptiles and amphibians that live on our property. Thankfully, lots of native snakes, but only a handful of native lizards. We have green anoles, island glass lizards, inland glass lizards, five-line skinks, and probably ground skinks. But I rarely see any of them. Most of what I see are these 6 non-native lizards. And all of them have a different story. In the upper left is the ubiquitous brown anole. Remember, they've been in Florida for 150 years. They have become a part of our ecosystems. The next, if you move from left to right in the top row, is a tropical house gecko. And there's a neat story with the tropical house gecko. They are one of 3 house geckos that live in Florida. We also have Mediterranean house geckos and Indo-Pacific house geckos. In the past, those other 2 species were more common. When the tropical house gecko was introduced, it was a better competitor, and in many areas, it's displaced the other 2. So this is an example of a newer invader actually getting rid of some of our older invaders. The next 2 lizards, the brown basilisk and the green iguana, aren't very common up here, but we see them from time to time, so I wanted to mention them. If you live in South Florida, you see these 2 much more often. The final 2 lizards are our most common here in Florida, the northern curlytail and the Peter's rockagama. These 2 have been in Florida for a long time, but in very isolated populations. You'd see them here or there, but not very common. In the last couple of years, both of these species have exploded in Florida. So they have hit that curve and they are spreading everywhere. My guess is that within the next decade, we're going to have as many agamas and curlytails as we do brown anoles. I live on the same island that I work on, except I'm 20 miles north of where I'm sitting. Where I live, until about a year ago, I didn't see any curlytails or agamas. Within the last year, they are everywhere. Here at the Florida Oceanographic Coastal Center, even as recently as 5 years ago, we didn't see too many. Now I see hundreds of them in a given day. They are not very good at dispersing. Remember when we talk about dispersal, reptiles aren't great at getting from point A to point B compared to other animals. We think that these lizards are primarily traveling in potted plants or landscape vehicles, but once they get from point A to point B, they take off really quickly. And they may be our next invasion story. And that's really the thing I'm going to leave you with. You never are able to truly know what your next lionfish or Burmese python is going to be. Through education, hopefully we can keep people from letting things go into the wild, because quite honestly, your next invasive species might be today's most popular pet. With that, I truly want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I had a great time, even without seeing your smiling faces. I'm imagining 200 plus of you staring back at me from home. I hope you enjoy being in your PJs rather than having to get dressed up and come out to the Blake Library. If you have any questions for me, this is a time to type them into the Q&A box. I'm happy to stay around for a while and chat with you. For those of you who have attended our lectures in the past, you know that these Q&A sessions sometimes go right up to 8 o'clock. Tonight can be no exception. If you enjoyed our lecture, please consider making a small donation to Florida Oceanographic Society. Over the years, we have worked really hard to provide these lectures to you free of charge. We've talked about charging a small fee, but we realized we'd get a much better audience by keeping these lectures free, and that's something we feel very strongly about. That said, Florida Oceanographic Society has been significantly impacted by COVID-19. So even if you can make a $1 donation or a $5 donation per lecture, it would mean the world to me, and it would help support our mission. To make a donation, just head over to our website. There's a donate tab at the top of our webpage. That's also where you can register for our next 9 lectures. With that, again, I truly want to thank you for making tonight a success. I don't know how it was from your end, but everything seemed to go very smoothly from my end. I hope you can see me and hear me okay. I also hope you learned a lot. And most importantly, I hope you all realize how stinking confusing the invasive species story is. There are scientists that have really denied the fact that not all invasions are awful. More and more research is showing that the invasion process is far more complicated than it seems at face value. All right, guys, let me pull up our questions and see if there's anything that I can answer. Would it be possible to get a copy of your PowerPoint? Great question. All of this year's lectures are going to be recorded. We are going to put the recordings up on our website, and even better, all of last year's lectures, and we had some world-class speakers last year, all of last year's lectures are also on our website. If you go to our lecture series tab and you scroll all the way to the bottom, there is a spot that says click here to watch videos of last year's lectures. I hope all of you will take advantage of that. You can see some incredible presentations from last year's lecture series. Uh-oh, somebody said there's a distinct echo on the feed. I really hope that echo has gone away. Let's see here. Are there plans for a lionfish rodeo or roundup this year? Thankfully, there are a number of nonprofits in Florida and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission that have led lionfish roundups. And even though we had COVID in 2020, they went ahead with their roundups. They kind of went with a do it on your own pace model instead of having everybody gather together all at once. But they were successful at holding lionfish roundups. Remember, when you look at an established invasion, it's not about wiping out the species, it's about controlling them. Whether it's a lionfish or a python, every one that you take out of the wild means that there are less harmful predators affecting our native species. So it's still good to try to eradicate or remove invasive species from the wild. Just know that those efforts aren't ever going to make these species disappear. How long does something have to be here to be considered native? That is completely an ethical question. I don't know that there's an answer to that. Humans have been moving things around for tens of thousands of years. If humans transported things to North America during the Ice Age, I would consider them a native species. If we moved things here 200 years ago, I don't know whether you'd call that native or not. I think that's something that everybody is going to have to figure out on their own. All right, let's see here. Could you briefly comment on the most harmful invasive species being humans? Absolutely. I said earlier that the feral cat is the most harmful invasive species on Earth. I'd say the most harmful species of animal. You are absolutely correct. Without a doubt, the most harmful species on Earth is us. We've done more to harm, the environment than anybody else. I'm going through a lot of these questions slowly because unfortunately, some of them are things that I've covered already, but I still want to read through them and check them out. Somebody asked, what do I do about the iguanas roaming on our seawall? There are wildlife removal services that will come out for a fee. Remember, everything's about money. They will come out and remove those iguanas for you. I'm going to say this very delicately. If you are so inclined, you can take the removal into your own hands. Iguanas are edible. There are people that cook them up for dinner. And that's all I'm going to say on that topic. Read between the lines. If you're an outdoors person and you are a hunter, you can remove those on your own. If not, you can call a nuisance wildlife eradicator. What is the impact of armadillos as a non-native species? Great question. I hope the person that asked that is still here. Believe it or not, there's still well over 100 of you tuned in. Armadillos are native to Florida. They're not an invasive species. They've been here for a really long time. They have experienced a range expansion, but humans didn't put them here. They didn't get relocated. There are a lot of stories of animals that people say are invasive and they're not. Another good one is the manatee. You have no idea how often I have people tell me that manatees were introduced to Florida. Imagine that. Somebody put a manatee in a boat and moved it to Florida. Totally not the case. Manatees have been here for tens of thousands of years. They're absolutely a native species. This is just an example of stories that get passed around from generation to generation. Armadillos are an example of a species that is here and has always been here and belongs here. I think I have time for maybe one more question. Let me take a look through here. Is the cane toad the same thing as a bufo? Growing up, I called them bufo toads. Lots of people call them bufo toads. That's not a really good name because the genus of toad that they originally belonged to was bufo. In fact, all of our toads most of our toads in North America belong to the genus bufo. By calling them bufo toads, it's not a real good description of them because most of our toads belong to the genus bufo. In fact, the cane toads that we talked about earlier, they moved to a new genus. They are now Rainilla toads. But yes, the ones that people call bufo toads are the exact same as cane toads or marine toads. All right, guys, I think I've gone through most of your questions. Uh, oh, coyotes. This is my last one. I'm going to take this one last. Are coyotes considered invasive? I would say no. Coyotes have undergone a natural range expansion. Historically, coyotes were found primarily west of the Mississippi River. They are now found in almost every state in the continental US. Believe it or not, I recently found a road-killed coyote on the barrier island, not South Hutchinson Island, but north of Sebastian Inlet. So they're on our barrier islands. However, humans did not move them here. They got here on their own. Now, where it gets tricky is they may have crossed bridges to get from one side of the Mississippi to the other, but they're pretty industrious animals. They could have just as easily crossed the ice if the Mississippi froze. I would consider coyotes an example of a natural range expansion. They belong here. They should be here, but they do have some consequences that people are slowly starting to get used to. All right, guys, we're hitting that 8 o'clock time. This is usually where the library would start flicking the lights to chase us outside. If any of you do have questions that I wasn't able to answer, or you think of any other questions, just go ahead and email them to me. My email is zjud@floridaocean.org. And again, I really want to encourage every single one of you to join us for the next 9 lectures. Please share this widely. Because we're not worried about space constraints at the Blake Library, we can fit as many of you as we want into our virtual lecture hall. I want you guys to come out in force to make these lectures a success. Because we have such great speakers, I want to show those speakers how great you guys are. We would not be able to do these lectures without an amazing audience. You know, most speakers, when they are asked to give a lecture, they expect to have 20 or 30 or 40 people in the audience. When I reach out to a prominent author or a world-renowned scientist and tell them that we have 200 to 300 people every night, I think they don't believe me until they show up and see the numbers. So again, guys, have a wonderful night. Thank you for your support, and hopefully we'll see you again at our next 9 lectures.